Praise be to God, there is no other God except God. There are hundreds of debates online between Sunnis and the Quranists about whether Hadith is necessary for the correct understanding of the Quran. According to the Quranists, Hadith is not necessary at all to understand the Quran correctly, while according to the Sunnis, Hadith is a necessary part of the understanding of the Quran correctly. And in all the debates you might have seen, you can never reach a conclusion based on the debates because those debates are not done in good faith. They are not really fully interested in the truth. They just throw a few verses here and a few verses there, hoping to catch the other party by surprise so that they can win the debate. Finding the truth requires a systematic process, not just looking at a few verses here and a few verses there, but at all the verses of the Quran. Only then should we allow ourselves to reach a decision about this issue. So that's what I did. Here it is. If you go to the Quran, any Quran glossary, you can see that the word hadith in all its grammatical forms is mentioned 36 times in the Quran. Here is one Quran glossary online. If you go to this link, which is neither maintained by the Quranists and neither by the Sunnis. It's not maintained by a religious project at all. It's maintained by a linguistic research group by the University of Leeds in UK. Now, as you can see here, the word hadith in all its grammatical forms is mentioned 36 times in the Quran. So I took all these cases, all these 36 verse numbers, and let me present them to you. So here we have all the verses in the Quran where the word hadith is mentioned. Let's go over these verses and see for ourselves, once and for all, what these verses say. By the way, the word hadith literally means story, or to tell, or to bring, or something new. And I will give the translation and the word hadith there in capital letters. And while I present the verses, please try to pay attention and see whether any of those verses tell us to follow the hadith, or the hadith of Muhammad, more specifically. So now let's see what each of these verses say. This verse says that buying entertaining stories, hadith, to mislead from the way of God without knowledge is prohibited. This verse says that we should tell, hadith, about God's blessings on us. In this verse, God asks Muhammad if the story, hadith, about the end of the world has reached him. This verse tells us that the servant of God asked Moses not to ask him anything until he tells him, hadith, about it. This verse tells us that people who are afraid to fight in the cause of God and do not understand that God is doing everything can hardly understand any story, hadith. This verse tells us that one of the many reasons that the waiting period is commanded by God before a believer divorces his wife is because perhaps God might bring, hadith, a solution to it. These verses tell us that telling your dream is a story, hadith. These verses tell us that the stories which are told about Moses and Abraham are stories, hadith. This verse tells us that the Jews hide the stories, hadith, of the Old Testament from the believers when they think that it will give supporting arguments to the believers. These verses tell us that the communities of these believers before the Quran, who were destroyed, remained as stories, hadith, among the other people after them. These verses tell us that on the day of judgment, people will not be able to conceal their life stories, hadiths, from God. These verses simply mention the Quran as a reminder which is new, hadith. These verses tell us that when people engage in conversations, hadith, which ridicule or deny or consider the verses of the Quran debatable or unimportant, then we should not sit with them until they change to another conversation. These verses tell us that the Quran is a true hadith story. These verses tell us that the Quran is the best hadith story. These verses tell us that believing or bringing any other hadith stories except the Quran is considered a bad idea in principle. So as you can see so far, in the verses which we covered here, there was not a single verse which obliged us or even recommended us to follow hadith as a religious source. As a matter of fact, these verses did not even connect hadith to Muhammad in any way. They were stories told by other people about other people, but not hadith or stories told by Muhammad or about Muhammad. Now, these last two verses, which I left in the end, actually do mention hadith from Muhammad, stories which Muhammad told. But let's look at what they say. In this verse, God prohibited the believers during Muhammad's time to seek stories, hadith, from Muhammad. And this last verse tells us that when one of Muhammad's wives spread a private story, hadith, from Muhammad to the other wife, she was asked by God to repent for doing it. So as you can see, even these last two verses which talk about hadith, stories from Muhammad, they are actually cases where God either prohibited the contemporaries of Muhammad to seek hadiths, stories from him, or he prohibited them to spread stories, hadith, from him, because they actually were Muhammad's private life, which had nothing to do with his messengership. His messenger persona, his public persona, was actually said through the Quran, not through hadith. What people today call hadith, a lot of it is either false or an intrusion into Muhammad's private life, which Muhammad never authorized, and which the Quran actually asks the believers to repent for sharing any aspect of Muhammad's private life without God's authorization. So this is everything that the Quran says about hadith. And as you can see, the Quran does not consider hadith a precondition or a requirement for understanding the Quran correctly or understanding religion correctly. Now, some Sunnis, even after all this, they will insist that we should still follow hadith because according to them, verse 7 of Surah 59 says that whatever the messenger gives you, take it. But from whatever the messenger stops you, do not take it. However, once you go and check the verse yourself, you can see that the verse does not talk about hadith at all, and they are only quoting a small portion of the verse. If you read the whole verse, you can see that it actually talks about the spoils which they won in war. Here is the whole verse. It says, whatever God restored to his messenger from the defeated communities shall go to God and his messenger in the form of charity. You shall give it to the relatives, the orphans, the poor, and the traveling alien. Thus it will not remain monopolized by the strong among you. Whatever the messenger gives you from it, take it. But from whatever the messenger stops you, do not take it. You shall reverence God. God is strict in enforcing retribution. So this is the whole verse, and you can clearly see that it is talking about the spoils of war, which should be distributed by God's messenger as charity, and not about hadith. Hadith is not mentioned here at all, explicitly or implicitly. The other verses which the Sunnis will typically bring to support their wrong idea of following hadith is the verses which say obey God and obey the messenger, like verse 592 for example. But they do not mention that the same verse says that the only duty of the messenger is to deliver the message. Balagu, delivery in Arabic. And this same word, balagu, we are told in verse 1452 that it refers to the Quran itself. So obeying the messenger only means what the messenger delivered as a messenger according to verse 592. And what Muhammad delivered as the messenger is the Quran itself, according to verse 1452. Nowhere in the Quran does it say that balagu, delivery, includes hadith. I already showed you all the verses where the word hadith is mentioned, and you can recheck them to see that hadith is not defined as balagu, delivery in them. Hadith, according to the Quran, is defined as simply stories which might be useful for historians, like all the other historical stories, like the stories of Napoleon or stories of Alexander the Great, which contain truths and falsehoods in them, to be studied by historians. But they are not religious texts and were never intended to be used as religious texts in the beginning, even in cases where they were factually true. Now, despite the overwhelming evidence from the Quran, some stubborn Sunni scholars still try to come up with some even weaker arguments to support their idea that hadith is a necessary part of religion. But the answers to all of them, the counter-arguments to all of them, are given in the book titled Quran, Hadith and Islam by Rashad Khalifa. So now the debate between the Quranists and the Sunnis is settled. The conclusion is that when it comes to religion, the Quranists are right about this issue. They are right when they claim that we do not need hadith at all to understand or apply the Quran correctly. However, pay attention now, this is important. Just because hadith is not a precondition for understanding or applying the Quran correctly, it does not mean that there are no other preconditions. The Quranists still fail to understand the Quran correctly because they do not meet those other preconditions. And I gave you those other preconditions in the following Friday's sermon, titled The Preconditions to Understand the Quran Correctly.